Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Usually when we talk about historical giants, right, like the people who fundamentally reshape society, there is this overwhelming expectation of visibility.
Right, yeah, like you expect to see their impact physically.
Exactly. Think about architecture for a second. You look at a massive cathedral or a sprawling university campus, and there is almost always a name carved in stone right above the door.
It operates on a very binary system of attribution. You build the thing, you get the credit.
You get the credit, right.
And it is a comforting way to view history, to be honest. We naturally want our legacies to be visible, to be easily categorized. We like to point to a statue or a building and say, well, that person did that.
It makes the sprawling, messy nature of human progress feel organized.
Exactly.
But then you step into the world of urban social work, you look at the history of rescue missions, and suddenly that entire system of neat attribution just completely falls apart.
It really is.
We are looking at a historical landscape today that is incredibly elusive, because we are going on a deep dive into the life of a man who is arguably the ultimate unsung founder.
Oh, absolutely.
We are talking about someone whose structural blueprints for social work and what he termed practical religion are still operating globally today. Yet his name is almost entirely erased from public memory. We are unpacking the life of David Nasmith.
And our overarching mission today for you, the listener, is to decode a rather staggering paradox. Because we have to figure out how a teenager from the early 1800s,
a kid who was literally deemed a slow learner by his frustrated teachers, by the way.
Right. How does he go on to build a vast international network of rescue missions? We need to understand how he paved the way for massive, globally recognized organizations like the YMCA, and how he fundamentally changed society's approach to poverty.
All while intentionally, almost aggressively avoiding the spotlight.
Yes. And we are drawing the insights for this discussion from a deeply researched text by Delores T. It's titled Practical Religion, David Nasmith and the City Mission Movement.
The author of our source material actually frames this paradox for us in a really visceral, geographic way. She describes an experience standing in London inside a former foundry that had been converted into the Wesleyan Chapel.
Right, which serves as a museum dedicated to the great reformer John Wesley.
Exactly. And it is exactly what you expect from historical greatness. There is a water pitcher with Wesley's face painted on it. His accomplishments are enshrined in glass cases. You walk through that space and think, yeah, this is what changing the world looks like. You leave artifacts.
Which sets up a rather jarring juxtaposition. Because after taking in all that visible legacy, the author walks across the street to Bunhill Fields Cemetery.
Oh, man.
She consults a guide that lists the famous Christian leaders buried there. She searches for David Nasmith's grave, and she finds it completely unknown. It is entirely uncelebrated by the general public. There is no museum. There are no commemorative water pitchers.
Wesley has the enshrined museum, and Nasmith has a silent, forgotten headstone. And I don't think this was an accident of history or, a failure of his PR team.
No, not at all.
This was a deliberate design choice. Nasmith operated with a highly specific, deeply ingrained philosophy regarding legacy. He explicitly refused to take credit for the movements he set into motion.
Right, he believed completely in giving all glory to God, viewing himself merely as a temporary instrument. He was pioneering this concept he called practical religion outside the walls of the church.
His absolute priority was building lives, not building buildings or personal monuments.
That philosophy is the engine driving his entire life's work. By prioritizing lives over monuments, he decentralized his own influence. Think about the implications of that for a moment. Most historical figures build centralized institutions where all roads lead back to them. Nasmith was creating something more akin to an environment.
It makes me think of an analogy from the tech world, actually. Nasmith operates exactly like an open source software developer.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. Consider the kind of programmer who writes the foundational code, the underlying architecture that basically runs the servers for the entire internet. They put it out there for free. They never slap a copyright on it.
They never put their name on a sleek corporate headquarters in Silicon Valley.
Exactly. No churches are named after Nasmith. No colleges have his name on the library. His legacy isn't a brand. His legacy is the operating system of city missions itself.
An operating system is invisible to the end user, but it dictates the environment in which every single application functions. Nasmith created an environment for social change that didn't require his ongoing presence to function.
Yeah.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it forces you to confront a rather uncomfortable question about human motivation. Like, what does it actually take to build something massive, something that alters the course of thousands of lives, without needing your name on the marquee?
Especially today. We live in a culture saturated by personal branding, where the work often serves to elevate the brand. Nasmith inverted that entirely. The brand, if you can even call it that, was entirely subservient to the work.
To understand how he achieved that level of absolute egoless humility, we really have to look at the crucible he was forged in. I would normally assume someone with the time and resources to start an international philanthropic movement was born into some kind of elite, wealthy family.
Yeah, that's usually the story.
But he wasn't. He was born in Glasgow in 1799, right into the suffocating smog of the Industrial Revolution.
And as we hinted at earlier, he was not a prodigy. By the time he was 11 years old, his teachers had basically given up on him. They went on record saying he had learned absolutely nothing.
The stigma of being labeled a failure at age 11 in the early 19th century was profound. Education was a privilege, and his parents, seeing no academic future for him, had to pivot. They sent him into the workforce under a system known as the bound apprentice.
And this system is crucial to understanding Nasmith's worldview. Being a bound apprentice was essentially a lottery with incredibly high stakes.
Right, because you aren't just taking a part-time job after school. You are legally tethered to an employer.
You are. For all intents and purposes, property.
You are. Now, his parents initially bound him to a pious manufacturer, someone who lived a morally upright life and ran a respectable business. It seemed like a safe placement. But the volatility of early industrial capitalism struck, and the business completely failed.
Which was catastrophic back then.
Oh, absolutely. In this era, when a business went under, the apprentices were liquidated, along with the looms and the raw materials. Nasmith was, using the phrasing from the text, sold like machinery to a wicked man.
Wow.
He was abruptly thrust into the brutal, unprotected underside of city life.
We really need to paint a picture of what that underside actually looked and felt like. Because when we say wicked man or brutal conditions, our modern minds might just picture like a boss who yells a lot or a factory without air conditioning.
Yeah, it was so much worse.
We're talking about agonizingly long work days, stretching from 6 in the morning until well after midnight. The physical toll on a young, growing body would be catastrophic. The food was scarce and terrible, and the psychological environment was even worse.
The living conditions were basically designed to break the human spirit. The most horrifying detail is where he slept. He wasn't given a small room to himself. He was forced to sleep in the same room, and often in the exact same bed, with hardened adult men.
Wait, the exact same bed?
The exact same bed. You have the novice in life, a sheltered 11-year-old kid occupying the most intimate, vulnerable space with veterans in sin.
I have to stop and push back on the narrative here, though. If you take an impressionable young kid, completely immerse him in an environment of vice, misery, and exploitation, and surround him with what the text calls masters of iniquity 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
How does he not just become a product of that environment? I mean, the trauma alone should have broken him. Why didn't he just become a hardened, cynical product of the slums?
Well, it is important to clarify that he didn't survive it completely unscathed. He absorbed the darkness of that environment, and his internal struggle is actually the key to his later success.
Interesting.
Nasmith's own journals from this period are incredibly revealing, and they completely strip away the myth of the pristine, untouched saint. He didn't paint himself as a pure victim floating above the filth. He admitted in his writing that he was the chief of sinners.
He actually felt the pull of the environment.
Deeply. He wrote that even when he was actively praying for deliverance from his situation, the sin remained, as he vividly described it, a sweet morsel under my tongue.
Wow.
He wasn't observing the temptation of the slums through a window. He was experiencing the moral degradation and the sheer physical exhaustion firsthand. He knew the allure of whatever coping mechanisms those hardened men were using because he felt the desperate need for them himself.
That completely reframes his entire approach to charity later in life. He understood the gravitational pull of the streets because he had felt it pulling on his own mind and body.
Which gave him an authentic, visceral empathy for the urban poor. It was an empathy that no sheltered theologian, studying the concept of poverty from a pristine university library, could ever possess.
Because the theologians were diagnosing a theoretical problem.
Exactly. Nasmith had lived inside the symptom.
That lived experience brings us to what I consider the absolute turning point of his life. It's the moment that defines this whole concept of practical religion. At age 16, he makes a profound personal commitment to his faith. He doesn't just go to church, he starts actively visiting the poor in his scarce free time.
Right.
And during these visits, he meets a woman who is incredibly destitute. To compound her marginalization, her husband is a slave. Nasmith approaches her with the standard orthodox intention of the day. He wants to help her spiritually. But then we get this anecdote that completely shifts his paradigm.
The realization with the spectacles.
Yes, the spectacles. He is sitting with this woman, and he realizes that just handing her a Bible, which was like the absolute gold standard of religious charity in the 19th century, is completely practically useless.
Because he is offering a tool she cannot use.
Why? Because she's completely illiterate, and her eyesight is failing. She physically cannot read the text. The traditional church would probably just preach the text at her and leave. But what does Nasmith do? He goes out, uses his meager funds to buy her a pair of spectacles, and then personally pays for her reading lessons.
It sounds like a simple act of charity to our modern ears, but it represents a profound seismic shift in methodology.
It is the ultimate user experience or UX design realization, but applied to 19th century theology.
That's a great comparison.
In modern tech, you can build the most powerful, transformative software application in the world, but if the user interface is broken, if the person cannot physically interact with the screen, the tool is a paperweight. Nasmith realized you cannot just throw theology at a physical barrier. You have to ensure the person can actually interface with the help you are offering. You have to fix the hardware, the eyesight, the literacy before the software faith can even load.
That UX analogy is incredibly apt. It captures the crux of the text's thesis perfectly. This is the very definition of Nasmith's practical religion. It is a definitive shift away from purely verbal proselytizing.
Just talking to people.
Yeah, the act of just talking at people from a pulpit or a street corner toward addressing holistic human needs. He understood, through the lens of his own brutal apprenticeship, that spiritual well-being is inextricably linked to physical well-being. A starving blind person cannot eat or read theology.
He's diagnosing the friction points between the human condition and spiritual relief.
And this grassroots, one-on-one intervention serves as his training ground. It prepares him for a shocking escalation in respondability. Because of his relentless energy and his practical approach, by the time he is 21 years old, he is appointed as the secretary to 23 different religious and philanthropic societies in Glasgow.
Wait, 23?
23. All of these organizations are operating out of a central hub called the Institution Rooms.
That is an unbelievable leap. He goes from buying one pair of glasses for one marginalized woman to managing the logistical operations for 23 different societies. At 21, I would assume he was completely overwhelmed.
It was a massive undertaking, but it was essentially a masterclass in administration. He is suddenly forced to learn the complex mechanics of massive social organization. He is interacting daily with ordained ministers, wealthy laymen, local politicians, and the most distinguished men of the city.
So he's mixing with the elites now.
Right. He is taking the raw, bleeding empathy forged in the slums and combining it with high-level logistical and administrative training. The text beautifully describes this period as him gathering practical wisdom from the great library of life.
And he was going to need every ounce of that practical wisdom because the socioeconomic situation in Glasgow was rapidly deteriorating into a full-blown crisis.
It really was.
By 1826, Glasgow's population has swelled to 100,000 people. The Industrial Revolution is churning out unprecedented wealth for the factory owners, but it is also churning out intense, densely concentrated poverty.
Yeah.
You have tens of thousands of people packed into tenements. And the traditional institutions, the established churches, are completely failing to handle the scale of the misery. The clergy are overwhelmed. They simply do not have the physical time to go into the slums and minister to these new massive populations.
Well, the lack of time was certainly a factor, but it was secondary to a much deeper institutional paralysis. The source material highlights a phenomenon it calls party feeling. Today, we would call it fierce denominational rivalry or sectarianism.
Theological turf wars.
Exactly that. It was preventing any coordinated systemic charity. A Presbyterian church wouldn't fund a missionary effort if the aid was going to benefit a Methodist neighborhood. The Episcopalians weren't going to pool their resources with the Baptists. It was highly territorial.
Wow.
So you have a massive starving population living in what Nasmith bluntly called ignorance and barbarism. And the religious leaders of the city are paralyzed, arguing over theological borders and protecting their own institutional silos.
Which creates a massive vacuum. And into that vacuum, Nasmith proposes the Glasgow City Mission. His solution to this gridlock is so radical for its time that it almost sounds too simple to us today, but we have to understand how it completely disrupted the 19th century religious establishment.
Oh, it was a huge disruption.
Yeah. He looks at the paralyzed clergy and decides to bypass them entirely. He proposes deploying laymen into the slums. He wants to use everyday working-class people, men without theological degrees, without titles, without formal ordination, to do the work the church was failing to do.
This is where his strategy shifts from being merely compassionate to being sociologically brilliant. Nasmith recognized a fundamental disconnect in communication. He saw that elite university graduates, men from the middle or upper classes who had studied theology in pristine academic environments, were completely ineffective when they walked into a slum.
They just didn't relate.
They literally and metaphorically did not speak the language. They didn't understand the daily, grinding, desperate reality of survival.
Because if you are freezing in a tenement worrying about cholera and your next meal, you aren't going to listen to a pristine lecture on morality from a guy in a tailored suit. It's insulting.
It is entirely alienating. So Nasmith sought out very specific psychological profiles for his agents. He looked for men who had either been pulled from the horrible pit and miry clay themselves,
meaning men who had lived similar lives of degradation, addiction, or poverty and had recovered.
yes, or men who possessed unusually deep human empathy and understood the inherent weakness of human nature.
He was basically inventing the concept of peer-to-peer intervention. He knew the slum dwellers would only listen to a guy who knew exactly how cold the floor was because he had slept on it too.
He weaponized shared trauma for social good. These agents could meet the marginalized on their own ground, sit in their cramped rooms, listen without judgment, and explain complex moral or spiritual concepts in everyday localized language.
That makes so much sense.
But deploying these empathetic laymen onto the front lines immediately introduced a massive ethical and practical complication. It is a complication that modern social workers and international aid organizations still grapple with constantly.
The Rice Christian dilemma. This part of the text absolutely fascinated me. It's such a dark, pragmatic reality of charity work.
Yes. The term Rice Christian was a colloquialism used to describe people who would convert to a religion, or at least feign deep religious interest, solely to receive food, clothing, or physical relief from missionaries.
It transforms salvation into a purely transactional relationship. Like if I say I believe your theology, you give my starting kids bread.
Exactly.
I'd imagine this was incredibly difficult for Nasmith's agents because their prime directive, their stated goal, was the spiritual welfare of the city. But they are walking into rooms where families are literally starving to death. You cannot just read a Bible verse to a starving child and walk away. How did they practically navigate that?
It required an incredible amount of nuance and emotional intelligence. The source material explicitly notes that ordinary humanity made it impossible for the agents to stay within the prime purpose. Their empathy, the very trait Nasmith hired them for, overrode this strict operational mandate.
They couldn't just preach.
No, they couldn't. So they gave physical help, they distributed food and coal, but they had to be hyper-vigilant not to create a system of dependency or to incentivize fake transactional conversions.
So how do you walk that tightrope on a random Tuesday in a tenement? How do you say, here is food, but I'm not paying for your belief?
They had to guide their philanthropy incredibly carefully, focusing strictly on addressing physical distress that could be removed. They weren't setting up permanent welfare salaries. They were interested in immediate crises, like a sickness, a sudden loss of employment, a harsh winter.
Just triage, essentially.
Right. It was a constant, exhausting tightrope walk. They had to show unconditional compassion, providing the coal regardless of whether the family attended a prayer meeting, while simultaneously demanding personal accountability and trying to foster long-term behavioral change.
And while he is architecting this incredibly complex social system, managing these agents and dealing with the political fallout from the clergy, Nasmith's personal life takes a beautiful but intensely difficult turn.
It does, yeah.
He marries Frances, and together they become this unstoppable power couple of 19th century philanthropy. But we have to be clear, their life is not glamorous. They aren't attending galas. They essentially live as pilgrims.
They embrace voluntary poverty.
Yeah, they travel relentlessly. from Glasgow to Ireland, across the Atlantic to the United States and Canada, then back to Paris, and finally London, establishing missions everywhere they set foot.
Frances Nasmith is a crucial, indispensable half of this story. She wasn't just a supportive spouse waiting at home. She was an active, strategic frontline operative. The text highlights a specific instance that perfectly illustrates her incredible courage and her refusal to accept the societal norms of the day.
Oh, the incident with the girls.
Yes. During their travels, she noticed that in one particular town, there were no less than 300 girl prostitutes operating.
300 in one town. That indicates a systemic collapse, not just individual moral failings.
Precisely. Many of these young women had been forced out of local factories due to economic downturns and had turned to the streets out of sheer desperation. They desperately wanted to abandon that life, but they had absolutely nowhere to go. They were entirely excommunicated from respectable society.
And the local critics, the established religious and civic leaders, looked at these 300 girls and declared the cases hopeless. It is that same binary restrictive thinking we talked about with the denominational turf wars. Society had written them off as a lost cause, a permanent moral underclass.
But Frances and David completely ignore the critics.
They don't write a strongly worded letter to the mayor. They take immediate practical action. They rent rooms, they hire dedicated women to minister to them and protect them, and they create a sanctuary.
And the source notes a devastating detail. One of these girls was actually the daughter of a respected minister. It shatters the illusion that poverty and desperation only happen to other people. It shows how far and how terrifyingly fast someone could fall through the cracks in that society.
It demonstrates the Nasmiths' absolute refusal to accept society's definition of a lost cause. But this brings up a massive logistical question. If they are constantly traveling and frequently facing literal starvation themselves.
Not to mention the emotional and physical toll of travel in the 1830s.
Right, and the tragic loss of several of their own children. How do they scale an international movement? I would assume you need a massive endowment or a network of wealthy Victorian venture capitalists to fund this kind of expansion. How do you go bankrupt and still launch a global enterprise?
You would think they needed a massive centralized fund, but their answer lies entirely in their grassroots methodology. First, on a personal level, they were anchored by an incredible discipline of prayer and strategic alignment. They kept a literal, written prayer list.
Oh, right.
But this wasn't just a list of vague hopes. It functioned more like a strategic vision board. They detail their operational goals, dedicating themselves afresh to the specific service of each new city they entered.
They were meditating on their strategic objectives. But practically, how did David get the funding and the manpower in a brand new city where he knew no one?
David Nasmith was fundamentally a master of grassroots community organizing. He had a hyper-effective networking tactic that didn't rely on mass media or large public spectacles.
Oh, I loved this detail in the source material. His networking strategy was basically a highly efficient math equation.
It was.
Yeah.
The text provides a fantastic quote summarizing his approach. It says, give him 12 persons around a table, and the chances are as 100 to 1 that the whole company would embrace his views.
He understood intimacy and persuasion. He didn't need to rent a massive stadium and preach to thousands of indifferent people. He just needed 12 influential people in a room.
Right.
His process was methodical. He would arrive in a new city, meticulously research the local power structures, find the people with influence, resources, or sheer operational competence, visit them individually to prime them, and then bring them together around a single table. His power of persuasion in a small group was described as wholly irresistible.
He was irresistible because he was pitching a vision that transcended all the petty, paralyzing squabbles of the day. He wasn't asking them to build a monument to a specific denomination. He was asking them to save their own city.
And that unifying vision was rooted in his absolute commitment to shattering boundaries. This brings us to what might be the most important operational rule of the city missions: strict non-sectarianism.
Oh yeah, that was huge.
Nasmith realized that the party feeling that paralyzed Glasgow was a universal threat. It would destroy a mission in Paris just as quickly as it did in Scotland. So he mandated a hard, non-negotiable rule. His agents were explicitly forbidden from trying to make people Protestants, Catholics, Baptists, Episcopalians, or Methodists.
The object was stripped down to its absolute core. Pluck sinners from the burning, bring them to a basic foundational faith, and provide physical relief. The agents were not allowed to recruit for a specific church roster.
It is that open source operating system again. It is an agnostic platform. He is essentially telling these religious leaders, look, I don't care if you run a Mac or a PC. I don't care about your specific theological interface. We have a city dying of cholera and starvation, and we just need to get this basic program running to save lives.
That's a really good way of framing it.
It unifies all these disparate, historically antagonistic groups under a single urgent goal. But here is where his vision gets truly radical. He didn't just shatter religious boundaries, he applied his operating system to shatter racial boundaries in a way that was decades ahead of his time.
This is an incredibly profound part of his story, and it centers on his relationship with a woman named Mary Watt. The source describes her as a West Indian woman living in Glasgow. Now, we have to understand the systemic barriers in place at that time.
Yeah.
In many established churches, there was a requirement known as a pew charge. You literally had to pay rent to sit in a specific seat during the service.
Which is just a wild, exclusionary concept to think about today, a literal financial paywall for church attendance. If you are poor, you are physically barred from the community.
And Mary Watt, being a marginalized immigrant woman, absolutely could not afford it. So Nasmith stepped in. He personally paid her pew charge for years so she could participate in the community.
Wow.
But he applied his practical religion further. He didn't just pay for her seat, he paid for her school lessons so she could learn to read. She attended his adult classes, she memorized large passages of scripture, and she proved to be an excellent, brilliant student. But more importantly than her academic success, she became his close personal friend.
The text makes a crucial observation here. It points out that through Mary's eyes and through their friendship, David Nasmith could intimately see and feel the pain and sorrow of the African diaspora and the horrors of slavery. He recognized firsthand that her intellect, her spirit, and her humanity were equal to anyone else's.
Right.
This directly, undeniably challenged the dominant racist dogma of the era.
This relationship wasn't just a nice anecdote. It profoundly shaped his international worldview. When Nasmith traveled to the United States in 1830 and 1831, he didn't behave like a polite, quiet tourist.
He didn't defer to the cultural norms of the American South.
No, he publicly and aggressively declared slavery is a curse on this land. We have to contextualize that. This is 30 years before the American Civil War. It was an incredibly dangerous stance to take.
Very dangerous.
Furthermore, because his philosophy of practical religion requires tangible action, he didn't just offer empty words of condemnation. He actively formed associations for the advancement of colored people. He took his systemic blueprint for organizing and applied it directly to confront systemic racial injustice.
It shows how universally applicable his blueprint was, whether the problem was illiteracy in Glasgow, prostitution in a factory town, or systemic racism in America. The operating system of grassroots, empathetic organization worked.
It did.
But his ambition inevitably collided with the ultimate stronghold of institutional tradition. In 1835, David and Frances moved to London, and they are immediately met with resistance from the highest levels of the religious establishment. They consult with an advisor, Reverend B.W. Knoll, and he basically writes them a letter saying, "Don't even try. It's impossible."
Reverend Knoll's warning perfectly encapsulates the rigid, hierarchical mindset of the Victorian era. He tells Nasmith that a London city mission is a pipe dream because there is a wide gulf between the dissenters.
The independent Protestant groups.
Right, and the establishment, meaning the powerful Church of England. Knoll essentially lays out the political gridlock. You need the bishop's formal consent to get the establishment clergy to act, and without the clergy leading the charge, the layman won't dare to move. He sees it as an insurmountable structural stalemate.
I find it so frustrating. The institutions are gridlocked over protocol while the streets are literally on fire. The source material cites these staggering statistics that were published in the Times newspaper, which fueled Nasmith's sense of desperate urgency.
Yeah, the numbers are just horrific.
We are talking about hundreds of thousands of people packed into rat-ridden, disease-infested buildings. The paper lists 500,000 Sabbath breakers, which indicates 500,000 people entirely disconnected from any social or moral institution. It lists 30,000 people living entirely by theft and fraud, and 100,000 habitual gin drinkers.
100,000.
The sheer scale of the misery is apocalyptic. You can't wait for a bishop's letter when 100,000 people are drinking themselves to death.
Faced with that apocalyptic reality, Nasmith does what he always does. He completely ignores the institutional advice. He ignores Reverend Knoll's warning about waiting for protocol. He defaults to his proven grassroots tactic.
Of course he does.
He meets with just two friends, Richard Edward Deere and William Bullock, in his own small, rented home. Just three guys sitting in the living room in London. They pray, they draft and adopt a constitution, and they launch the London City Mission.
Three guys in a living room taking on the misery of millions. And because the operating system is so perfectly designed, the growth is explosive. Within 6 months, they have 10 full-time agents. Within 12 months, they have 40 agents working daily in the worst slums of London.
It's incredible.
They establish an official headquarters in Red Lion Square. It proves definitively that Reverend Knoll was wrong. The demand for practical religion was massive, and the laymen were more than ready to do the work with or without the bishop's permission. But Nasmith, being relentlessly driven, couldn't just manage one successful organization. He sees needs everywhere, and he immediately starts launching other societies out of the exact same headquarters.
Which leads directly to the great scandal of his London tenure. Nasmith viewed himself fundamentally as a general moral agent. He couldn't compartmentalize suffering, so alongside the booming London City Mission, he forms the Adult School Society to combat illiteracy, the Young Men's Association, and, most controversially, the London Female Mission, which was a dedicated rescue mission for prostitutes.
And here's the architectural detail that caused the absolute meltdown of the London establishment. He sets up this rescue mission for prostitutes right next door to the respectable London City Mission offices. And for pure logistical convenience, so he can manage both, he connects the two buildings with an internal door.
The committee of the London City Mission, which was now filled with prominent, respectable citizens, was, as the text explicitly states, horrified. They officially condemned it as an indelicate and imprudent action.
An internal door. That was the absolute line they wouldn't cross. They were fine helping the poor as long as the truly scandalous poor used a different entrance.
It perfectly highlights the massive tension between Victorian respectability politics and true frontline rescue work. The committee members were terrified of the optics. They didn't want their respectable, increasingly famous mission physically connected to a house of fallen women. It threatened their social standing. So one after another, the most important, wealthy members of the committee resigned in protest. They tried to force his hand.
So, what does Nasmith do? Does he apologize? Does he board up the door to save the city mission he just spent his lifeblood founding? Does he compromise to keep his title? No. He resigns.
Yep.
He basically looks at the committee and says, if you care more about your social reputation than the lives of these women, you run this place. I'm out. He walks away from his own creation and simply forms yet another society, the British and Foreign Mission. It proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that he cared exponentially more about the actual messy work of saving lives than he did about institutional approval, optics, or holding on to a prestigious title.
His resignation is the ultimate proof of his character. He was entirely uncorrupted by his own success. But here's the brilliant part. Even though he left, the system he designed for the London City Mission, the operating system itself, remained firmly in place. The source material provides us with the actual addendum, which outlines the foundational rules and bylaws for the agents.
Yeah.
And looking at these specific instructions, it becomes crystal clear that this wasn't just random emotional feel-good charity.
Oh, not at all. This is where you see the genius of the operating system in its purest form. It is a highly sophisticated, standardized operating procedure, an SOP for early social work. It is brilliantly pragmatic. Let's look at the math behind some of these rules. First, the ratio. One agent was hired for every 400 families.
That ratio wasn't arbitrary. It was carefully calculated to ensure both broad coverage across the city and consistency in the relationships. It meant an agent could reasonably visit each family once a month while also holding 3 local religious meetings weekly in their specific assigned geographic area. It was systemic intervention.
But the instructions on how to interact are what really blow me away. Rule number 1, make it your first effort to secure their confidence. State to them in an easy and affectionate manner the object of your visit. He is literally teaching his agents de-escalation and relationship building. He knows you can't just kick down a door and start preaching.
Right.
And then there is my absolute favorite practical rule. Avoid encroaching upon the necessary occupations of the families. No calls to be made during dinner hour.
That specific instruction shows such profound, granular respect for the dignity and the time of the poor. He knew from his own time as a starving apprentice that bursting into a cramped home while a stressed family is trying to eat their meager, hard-earned meal is not going to win any hearts. It will breed resentment.
Yeah, nobody wants that.
It demonstrates the deep-lived empathy we discussed earlier. He also instructed agents to faithfully but prudently reprove open vice. There's a calculated balance there between offering moral guidance and having the tact not to alienate the people you were trying to help.
He also deeply understood the economic barriers to progress. He instructed his agents to make it their business to find Sabbath schools in their assigned districts, but he specifically noted they must find schools that had a low fee and direct the children there. He knew there was absolutely no point in recommending a prestigious school the family couldn't afford.
Right.
It is that spectacles logic applied to the education system. Don't offer a solution they can't access.
The entire playbook, every single rule, is designed to remove friction between the desperate need of the people and the practical solution being offered. And because the system was so logically and empathically designed, it didn't require David Nasmith to be in the room to function. It was self-replicating. Which brings us to the generational legacy of his work.
Let's talk about that.
The theme of the text's final section is literally from generation to generation. By 1837, Nasmith had been directly instrumental in founding over 60 city and town missions across multiple countries.
60 missions, all running his code. And here's the ultimate surprise for the listener, the hidden historical Easter egg of this entire deep dive. Nasmith's vision didn't just stay within the strict city mission framework. As part of his broader strategy to protect vulnerable populations, he founded these groups called Young Men's Societies.
Yeah, this is fascinating.
He saw the desperate need to protect, educate, and mobilize the thousands of young men flooding into the industrial cities looking for work. And those specific societies directly paved the way for the YMCA.
The historical connection is undeniable. The source text explicitly links Nasmith's early young men's societies in Glasgow and his later vision in London to the eventual formation of the Young Men's Christian Association. There is an old architectural drawing from New York City that even shows the YMCA and the city mission sharing the exact same building.
Oh, wow.
This was exactly how Nasmith envisioned it. Different branches of practical religion working in tandem to support the whole person. The Montreal YMCA's waterfront mission heavily resembled Nasmith's operational model, and later historical sketches from the YMCA explicitly state that they were realizing Nasmith's original dream to address the claimant needs of millions of men.
His blueprint created a global ripple effect that is just staggering to track. The text traces the movement far beyond the UK. It goes to the Sydney City Mission in Australia, founded in 1862. It influenced a man named John Little, who then deeply impacted Jerry and Maria Macaulay.
Right, in New York.
And the Macaulays became the founders of the massive American Rescue Mission movement. And I have to mention the story of the Stockholm City Mission in Sweden because it's such a perfect encapsulation of his method.
The story of Matilda and the hot potatoes.
Yes. Matilda is out in the devastating, freezing poverty of Stockholm. She is going door to door, armed with the gospel, but also carrying literal hot potatoes to keep people warm and fed. It's the spectacles all over again.
Exactly.
She tells her local pastor about the absolute horrors she is seeing in the slums. The pastor is moved, he is heartbroken, but he is a traditional clergyman. He doesn't know what to structurally do. So he visits another city, observes a city mission operating perfectly on Nasmith's blueprint, brings that exact system back to Sweden, and founds the Stockholm City Mission. It altered the city so profoundly that school children in Sweden learn about that pastor today.
Yet the pastor gets the credit in the history books, while Nasmith's blueprint silently enabled the entire operation. It is the perfect poetic encapsulation of his legacy. The vision outlived the man because he completely decentralized the power. He didn't build a cult of personality around David Nasmith. He empowered local people like Matilda and her pastor to take responsibility for their own cities using his tools.
He gave them the open source code and told them to run it locally, and he pushed himself to the absolute physical limit doing it. The text notes that David Nasmith achieved all of this, the 60 missions, the global network, the blueprints for the YMCA by age 40.
It's just wild.
He died incredibly young, completely exhausted, having frequently faced starvation, bankruptcy, and public scorn. But he fundamentally altered the course of human history.
There is a beautiful, quiet detail near the very end of the source material that ties this entire sprawling narrative together. The author describes visiting a mission in India during a time of intense, violent religious riots between Muslims and Hindus.
Oh, yeah.
The city missionaries are out there in the slums and the train stations, doing the gritty, practical work, despite the extreme danger. The author asks the director if they ever get hit or attacked while out there, and the director just looks at her like she asked a ridiculous question and says, "Of course, sister."
Because the danger, the friction is just part of the job. You don't retreat behind an internal door when things get messy.
Exactly that. And then the author goes up to the director's tiny, cramped apartment, which serves as the mission's central office. And taped to the side of a filing cabinet, there is a little sign featuring Nasmith's favorite Bible verse, the one he leaned on throughout his grueling, chaotic life. I could do all things through Christ.
Wow.
That specific verse, tied to that specific mission structure, traveled from a young, traumatized apprentice in a Glasgow slum in the 1820s all the way to a filing cabinet in a riot-torn city in India over a century later. That is the enduring, unstoppable power of practical religion.
It is an unbelievable journey. We started with a kid deemed a slow learner, a kid sold like machinery, and bound to a wicked master in the industrial soot of Glasgow. And we watched him realize that handing a blind woman a book wasn't enough, that true faith requires a pair of spectacles.
Yeah.
He took that simple, profound realization of UX design, scaled it up, bypassed the gridlocked institutions, and deployed an army of empathetic laymen to change the world one city, one heart, one hot potato at a time. And he did it all while intentionally erasing his own name from the narrative.
He proved definitively that true, systemic, lasting change rarely comes from those actively seeking to see their name carved in stone. It comes from those willing to work in the unseen trenches, utilizing whatever practical tools are at their disposal, driven by a deep empathy born of shared human frailty.
Which brings us right back to that quiet cemetery in London, Bunhill Fields. John Wesley has the museum across the street, the water pitcher, the visible celebrated legacy. David Nasmith has a grave that almost no one visits, but his operating system is humming away, saving lives in thousands of rescue missions across the globe today. So I want to leave you, the listener, with this final provocative thought to mull over. If you completely stripped away your own desire for personal credit, for legacy, for institutional approval, if you genuinely didn't care who got their name on the building, what kind of lasting blueprint could you build for your community today?